Mark and Laura Evans stood in front of their new home, an old Victorian with its steep gables and intricate woodwork casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Laura felt a shiver run down her spine, though the day was warm. Something about the house, the entire neighborhood in fact, felt off. The quaint little town of Ashford had been welcoming enough with its cobblestone streets and friendly locals, but there was an unspoken tension whenever anyone mentioned their new address. It wasn't the house they were moving into that caused people to avert their eyes and speak in hushed tones. It was the house next door. That house loomed like a decaying sentinel, a hulking mass of darkness among the otherwise bright and cheerful neighborhood. Its windows were shattered, the paint peeling away in great jagged strips like flesh from a rotting corpse. Mark had laughed when he first heard the rumors, stories of a murder so gruesome that the very walls of the mansion were said to be stained with blood. Laura had laughed along with him at the time, but now, standing in the shadow of the derelict mansion, the laughter felt far away. "It's just an old house, Laura," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring. He squeezed her hand, but she noticed how his eyes kept flicking toward the mansion, as if expecting to see something or someone in the darkened windows. They moved in quickly, eager to put the superstitions behind them. The first few days were peaceful, almost normal. They spent their time unpacking, decorating, and settling into their new life. The house was cozy and full of character, with creaking floors and drafty hallways that spoke of its long history. Yet Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, the result of hearing too many ghost stories from the townspeople. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of her mind. Late one night, Laura awoke to the sound of footsteps. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark was beside her, still asleep. The footsteps were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. They seemed to be coming from the hallway outside their bedroom, moving slowly, deliberately. Laura held her breath, straining to hear. For a moment, everything was silent, and she began to think it had been her imagination. Then the whispering began. It was a soft, indistinct murmur, like a conversation held behind a closed door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as the whispers grew louder, echoing through the hallway. They seemed to be coming from all around, surrounding her, pressing in on her mind. "Mark," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred groggily, opening his eyes to see the terror in hers. "Do you hear that?" He listened, frowning into the darkness. The house was silent again. He sighed and pulled her close. "It's just the house settling. These old places make all sorts of noises." But Laura knew it was more than that. She lay back down, her body tense, eyes fixed on the bedroom door. For hours she listened to the silence, waiting for the footsteps and whispers to return. They didn't. Not that night. The next morning, Laura tried to put the events out of her mind. She busied herself with unpacking, setting up the kitchen, and arranging furniture. Mark left for work, leaving her alone with her thoughts. By midday, the house felt almost normal again, and she managed to convince herself that it had all been a dream. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor, the feeling of being watched returned. She stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the mansion next door. Its dark, empty windows stared back at her like hollow eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow passing by one of the windows on the second floor. She gasped, stepping back from the window, her heart racing. Could someone be living there? She remembered the stories the townspeople had told, the murders, the doctor who went mad. They said his spirit still lingered, along with the souls of his family. Laura shook her head, trying to clear her mind of such thoughts. It was just a story, a legend meant to scare people away from a house that no one wanted. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, more deliberate. Laura lay frozen in bed, her eyes wide open in the darkness. She could hear them clearly, moving up and down the hallway, stopping just outside their bedroom door. Then the doorknob rattled as if someone was trying to open it. She held her breath, her body trembling. Mark woke beside her, hearing it too this time. "What the hell?" he muttered, getting out of bed. He grabbed a baseball bat he kept by the side of the bed and moved toward the door. Laura watched, her heart in her throat, as he slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty. Mark checked every room, every closet, even the attic. There was no one there. He came back to the bedroom, his face pale. "There's nothing. No one." Laura felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. If there was no one there, then what had they heard? She wanted to tell him about the shadow she had seen in the mansion's window earlier, but she held back, not wanting to seem paranoid. In the following days, the incidents grew more frequent. The footsteps, the whispers, the shadows in the corner of her eye, and the dreams. Laura started having vivid nightmares about the mansion. She saw the doctor, his face obscured by shadows, standing over a figure strapped to a table, his hands moving in quick, precise motions. In the dream, the figure on the table screamed, a scream that echoed in Laura's mind long after she woke up. Mark began to notice the toll it was taking on her. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning, touching the dark circles under her eyes. "Maybe we should stay somewhere else for a while, take a break." But Laura shook her head. "No, we can't just leave, we have to know what's going on." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. She hesitated, then told him about the dreams, about the feeling of being watched, about the shadow in the mansion's window. As she spoke, Mark's expression changed from concern to something darker, fear. He wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize it away, but he had felt it too. The house next door was not just an old, abandoned building. It was something more, something alive. They decided to dig deeper into the history of the mansion. What they found was more disturbing than they could have imagined. The previous owner, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, was a surgeon who had become obsessed with the idea of conquering death. He conducted experiments, they learned, on both willing and unwilling subjects. The townspeople had whispered that he practiced dark rituals, using forbidden knowledge to try and bridge the gap between life and death. When his family was found dead, brutally murdered, the townspeople believed it was his doing, a final twisted experiment gone wrong. No one knew for certain what happened in that house, but one thing was clear. Whatever Dr. Cartwright had unleashed, it was still there, trapped within the walls of the mansion, waiting. And now it had noticed them. That night, Laura sat by the window, staring at the mansion. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass. In the darkness of the mansion's windows, she saw something move, slowly, deliberately. It was a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. She blinked and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. As she turned away from the window, she felt a cold breath on her neck and heard a whisper, clear and distinct this time. "Come closer." Laura screamed, backing away from the window. Mark rushed into the room, his face pale with fear. "What happened?" She pointed at the mansion, her hand shaking. "It's real. It's not just a story." Mark stared at the mansion, his jaw clenched. He put his arm around her, holding her tight. "We need to find out what it wants," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the mansion's darkened facade. And as they stood there, holding each other in the darkness of their home, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The house next door had woken up, and it wasn't going to let them go easily. The unease in their home intensified with each passing day. Laura's nightmares grew more vivid, more invasive. Sleep became an exercise in fear, her dreams filled with images of dark corridors and the twisted visage of Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the doctor from the mansion next door. Each morning she woke up drenched in sweat, her hands trembling as she struggled to piece together the fragments of her dreams. Mark's concern for her well-being turned into a desperate fear of his own as he began to sense a growing darkness in their house. One evening, as Laura prepared dinner, she glanced out of the kitchen window toward the mansion. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the mansion shrouded in shadows. She felt that familiar chill crawl up her spine. As her eyes scanned the windows, she saw it, a faint flicker of movement on the mansion's second floor. She squinted, heart pounding, and for a brief moment she could have sworn she saw a figure standing there, half hidden behind the tattered curtain. Its outline was barely distinguishable in the dim light, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. "Mark," she called, her voice trembling. He rushed into the kitchen, seeing the fear in her eyes. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the mansion. "Do you see it?" He stared into the growing darkness, his eyes locked on the window she was pointing at. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to turn away, the figure moved. It wasn't a trick of the light or Laura's imagination. It was there, someone, in that house, watching them. Mark felt his blood run cold. "We need to go over there," Laura said, her voice shaky but resolute. Mark turned to her, disbelief and concern in his eyes. "What?" "No, Laura. We can't just go in there. We don't even know what we're dealing with." "But we need to know," she insisted. "If we don't confront it, it's just going to keep getting worse." Mark hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the fear of what they might find. "Fine," he finally said, his voice tight. "But we go during the day, and we're not staying there long." The next morning, they made their way to the mansion. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if inviting them inside. Mark pushed it open, and they were greeted by a stale, musty smell. The air inside was heavy and oppressive, thick with dust and decay. As they stepped into the foyer, the floorboards creaked underfoot, their echoes amplifying the silence of the house. The rooms were filled with relics of the past, old furniture covered in white sheets, family portraits lining the walls, their faces blurred by time and dust. It was as though the house had been frozen in the moment of its last terrible day, a mausoleum for the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Laura wandered into the living room, where an old grand piano sat in the corner. She reached out, running her fingers across the keys, and was startled when one of them let out a dull, discordant note. The sound seemed to hang in the air, reverberating through the silence like a warning. She felt a sudden rush of cold air, like a breath against her cheek, and pulled back, her heart racing. "Mark," she called out, her voice quivering. He appeared from the hallway, his face pale. "There's a basement," he said. "I found the door, but I don't think we should go down there." Laura felt a shiver of fear and curiosity. She knew they had to see it. They had to know what lay at the heart of this house's darkness. Together, they made their way to the basement door. It was an old, heavy door with a rusted handle that groaned as Mark turned it. The door swung open, revealing a dark staircase that descended into the abyss. With a deep breath, Mark took out a flashlight and started down the stairs, Laura following close behind. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around them, pressing in like a vice. At the bottom, they found themselves in a large open space. The basement was filled with strange, unsettling relics, old medical equipment, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and in the center of the room, an old, rusted operating table. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Mark, what is this place?" Mark moved the flashlight around, illuminating the walls. They were covered in symbols and writings, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was no ordinary basement. It was a place of death, of twisted experiments and dark rituals. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, their breath misting in the air. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Laura felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy, like a hand. She screamed, backing into Mark, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you feel that?" she gasped. "Something touched me." Mark held her close, trying to keep his own fear in check. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they turned to leave, the basement door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang. They both froze, staring up at the door, their hearts hammering in their chests. The flashlight flickered again and went out, plunging them into darkness. Mark fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on. He could hear Laura's ragged breathing beside him, feel her trembling. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, growing louder, echoing through the basement. It was the same voice Laura had heard in her dreams, Dr. Cartwright's voice. "You came closer," the voice hissed, filling the room, seeping into their minds. Mark finally got the flashlight to work, its beam slicing through the darkness. He pointed it at the operating table, and they both gasped. A figure lay on the table, its face obscured, body covered in a sheet stained with dark, dried blood. Mark's hand shook as he moved the light, revealing the face. It was Laura. She stared down at her own lifeless face, her eyes wide open, mouth twisted in a silent scream. Mark stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Laura clutched his arm, her eyes locked on the horrifying sight. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This can't be real." The figure on the table slowly turned its head to look at them, its eyes locking onto Laura's. "Join us," it whispered in a voice that was hers and not hers at the same time. Mark pulled Laura, dragging her toward the stairs. He threw himself against the basement door, pounding on it, screaming for help. The whispers grew louder, filling the basement with a cacophony of voices, all crying out in pain and anger. Just as Mark thought they were trapped forever, the door suddenly gave way, opening with a force that sent them tumbling out onto the ground floor. They scrambled out of the mansion, running blindly into the daylight. Mark slammed the front door shut behind them, and they stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the house. It was silent again, its windows dark and empty, but they both knew it was far from over. Whatever resided in that house was aware of them now, aware that they had trespassed into its domain. Back in their own home, they tried to make sense of what had happened. Mark poured a stiff drink for both of them, his hands still shaking. Laura sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. "We shouldn't have gone in there," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. "We made it worse." Laura nodded slowly, her eyes unfocused. "It showed me, myself, dead. It wants us, Mark. It wants us in that house." Mark placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the cold sweat on her skin. "We need help," he said. "We can't do this alone." That night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, filled with anger and malice. And the footsteps, those damn footsteps, echoed through the house, growing closer and closer. Laura lay awake, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door, waiting for it to rattle, for the doorknob to turn. When Mark finally fell asleep, he too was visited by nightmares. He found himself back in the mansion's basement, standing over the operating table. The figure beneath the sheet was no longer Laura, it was him. He watched in horror as the doctor stepped into view, his face twisted into a grotesque smile, surgical tools glinting in his hand. Mark tried to scream, but his voice was gone, stolen by the darkness that surrounded him. He woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Beside him, Laura lay still, her eyes open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He reached out to touch her, and she turned to look at him, her eyes wide and terrified. "Did you have the dream?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. Mark nodded, his throat tight with fear. "Yes." They both knew that whatever they had stirred in that house wasn't done with them. It had crossed the threshold into their lives, and now it was only a matter of time before it claimed them. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. Mark and Laura avoided the mansion at all costs, keeping their blinds drawn, but they could still feel its oppressive presence looming over them. Their once cozy home had become a place of fear, where every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind felt like an omen. They were prisoners in their own house, trapped by an unseen force that had crossed the line between their nightmares and reality. Mark reached his breaking point first. He began researching paranormal activity, desperate to find answers. Laura watched as he pored over old books, scanned obscure websites, and contacted people he had never imagined he would seek out: psychics, mediums, and paranormal investigators. He spoke to one man, James Carr, a well-known paranormal investigator who had a reputation for dealing with entities that defied explanation. James listened to Mark's story with a grim expression. "You're dealing with something ancient," James said over the phone. "Something that doesn't just haunt places but people. It has latched onto you, and it won't let go unless it's forced to." "Forced to?" Mark asked, his voice strained. "How do we do that?" "There are ways," James replied, "but they are dangerous. You're going to have to face whatever it is directly, confront it where it's strongest." Mark knew what James meant. The mansion. The idea of returning there made his blood run cold, but he had no choice. They had crossed a line when they entered that house, and now they had to confront the consequences. He arranged for James to visit them, hoping that the investigator could provide some clarity or at least a plan to rid them of the entity's grip. When James arrived, he immediately set to work. He was a tall, serious man with a calm demeanor that belied the darkness he often faced. He moved through their house with a purposeful stride, setting up cameras, audio recorders, and motion sensors. As he worked, he explained the entity's behavior to Mark and Laura. "It's feeding on your fear," James said. "Every time you acknowledge it, every time you react to it, you're giving it more power. It's trying to drive you into a state of complete terror, because that's when it can manifest in its full form." Laura shivered at his words. She had felt it growing stronger, its presence more invasive, more real. Nights had become unbearable. The whispering never ceased now. It was a constant background noise that only she seemed to hear. And the shadows, they no longer stayed at the corners of her vision. She could see them moving across the walls, stretching toward her in the dim light, almost tangible. James set up his equipment in the living room for the first session. Mark and Laura sat on the couch, watching as he lit candles and sprinkled salt around the room. The air was heavy and the house seemed to hold its breath. James turned on an audio recorder and began asking questions into the silence. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady. "What do you want with them?" For a long time, nothing happened. Laura felt a small flicker of hope that perhaps it was all in their minds, that the entity wouldn't respond. But then from the recorder came a faint, crackling noise. James played it back, and they listened, their faces pale. Through the static, a voice could be heard, a deep, distorted whisper that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. "Come, closer," it hissed. Laura clutched Mark's hand, her eyes wide. It was the same voice from her dreams, the same voice that had whispered to her in the mansion's basement. James continued the session, his face grim. "Why are you here?" he asked. Another crackle, followed by the voice again, clearer this time. "To finish what was started." "What was started?" Mark demanded, his fear giving way to anger. "What did you do?" The room grew colder, the candles flickering wildly as the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe. The voice came again, louder, more insistent. "The ritual was incomplete," Laura gasped, her mind reeling. She had seen glimpses of it in her nightmares, the doctor standing over the operating table, chanting words she could not understand. He had been trying to break through the barrier between life and death, to merge the spiritual and physical worlds in some grotesque ritual, and now the entity was using them to finish what he had started. James quickly ended the session, sensing the danger. He turned to Mark and Laura, his face drawn. "It's using you to complete the ritual. It wants to break free of this place, to cross over fully into our world, and it can't do that without a sacrifice." Laura felt a chill run through her. "A sacrifice," she whispered. "Us?" James nodded grimly. "One of you or both. It doesn't care. It just needs to finish what the doctor started." Mark stood, pacing the room, his hands clenched into fists. "Then we have to stop it. We have to go back into that house and end this once and for all." "Yes," James agreed, "but you need to understand that this won't be like last time. It knows you're coming. It will do everything in its power to stop you. You need to be prepared for that." The plan was set. They would go back to the mansion the following night, armed with the knowledge and tools James provided: salt, iron, and a ritual designed to sever the entity's connection to both the mansion and to Mark and Laura. It would be dangerous, but it was their only chance to escape its grasp. As night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. Mark and Laura sat together, holding hands, their minds racing with fear and anticipation. Laura had insisted on staying awake, but as the hours dragged on, her eyelids grew heavy. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to find herself back in the mansion's basement in her dreams. This time, the scene was clearer. She was standing in the middle of a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by symbols painted in blood. Dr. Cartwright stood across from her, his face obscured by shadows, holding a scalpel in his hand. He looked at her with hollow eyes, and she felt his voice inside her head rather than hearing it with her ears. "You are the key," he whispered. "Through you, I will be free." She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. He stepped closer, raising the scalpel, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if the blade had already pierced her heart. The shadows around her swirled, whispering her name. She woke with a start, gasping for air, clutching her chest. Mark held her, his face etched with worry. "You were screaming," he said. "What did you see?" She told him about the dream, her voice shaking. "He said I'm the key, Mark. He wants to use me to break free." "We won't let that happen," Mark said firmly. "We're going to end this." The next night, they returned to the mansion with James, armed with candles, salt, iron rods, and the ritual book. They made their way inside. The house was different this time. The air was heavy with malice, the darkness almost tangible. It seemed to breathe, to pulse with a life of its own, reacting to their presence. They moved toward the basement, each step an exercise in willpower as the house seemed to resist them. The door to the basement stood wide open, as if welcoming them into the abyss. They descended the stairs, Mark leading the way with an iron rod in hand, James chanting softly under his breath. In the basement, the operating table sat in the center, covered in dust and decay. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, as if waiting for the ritual to begin. They formed a circle of salt around the table, positioning candles at each cardinal point. James began the ritual, his voice rising above the whispers that filled the basement. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on them. Laura stood in the circle, her heart pounding, as Mark and James chanted the incantations meant to sever the entity's connection to their world. But the mansion resisted. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that lunged at the circle, only to be repelled by the salt. The entity's voice filled the room, a guttural roar of anger and desperation. "Mine, mine, mine," it chanted, its voice merging with the shadows. Laura felt a pull, a force tugging at her from within the circle. She glanced down and saw that the salt line was beginning to break, the shadows pushing through. Panic surged through her. "It's breaking through," she cried. Mark and James chanted louder, but the entity was relentless. Laura felt her feet begin to move against her will, dragging her toward the operating table. She fought against it, but the pull was too strong. The shadows wrapped around her ankles like tendrils, pulling her into the darkness. "Mark," she screamed, reaching out to him. He grabbed her hand, holding on with all his strength. "I won't let you go." But as he pulled, he felt the force pulling back, stronger than anything he had ever felt. He glanced at James, who was still chanting, his face twisted in concentration. The room shook, the walls vibrating with the entity's rage. "Finish the ritual," James yelled over the cacophony. "Now!" Mark knew what he had to do. He reached for the iron rod, lifting it high. The entity screamed, its voice a chorus of agony. He drove the rod into the ground, into the circle, completing the final part of the ritual. Light erupted from the circle, blinding and searing, filling the basement with a brilliant flash. The shadows recoiled, the entity's scream piercing the air. Laura felt the pull release her, and she stumbled back into the circle, gasping for breath. The darkness shrieked and writhed, then imploded, sucked back into the symbols on the walls. Silence fell. The basement was still. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving them standing in the dim candlelight, trembling and exhausted. James lowered his arms, his face pale and drawn. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "The connection is broken." Mark pulled Laura into his arms, holding her tightly. They had faced the darkness and survived, but they knew it would never truly leave them. The mansion stood as a grim reminder of what they had endured and the entity they had confronted. As they left the basement and made their way out of the mansion, they looked back one last time. The house was silent, its windows dark and empty. But deep within its walls, they could still feel it, a lingering presence, bound but not defeated, waiting. In the quiet of their home that night, as they lay in bed, Laura heard a faint whisper, barely audible. It was a voice she recognized, a voice that filled her with dread. "It's not over," it said, a promise of terror yet to come. The days after the ritual were eerily quiet. Mark and Laura knew they had only bought themselves time. The mansion stood like a beast, wounded but far from dead, its dark windows reflecting the turmoil that churned inside it. They had managed to sever the entity's immediate hold, but both could feel it lingering, a heavy presence that clawed at the edges of their minds. Laura tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. She cleaned the house obsessively, cooked elaborate meals neither of them could eat, and attempted to fill the silence with anything that would drown out the whispers that persisted in the back of her mind. Mark, on the other hand, was restless. He spent hours in his study, researching, reading through every book and website on the paranormal he could find. He knew the entity wasn't gone. It was simply biding its time, waiting for them to let their guard down. A week passed and then another. On the surface, life seemed to settle, but the tension between them grew, an unspoken understanding that this was the calm before the storm. They had come so close to losing everything, and the fear of what might come next gnawed at them like a festering wound. Then, on a cold, moonless night, the quiet broke. It began with a single knock at the door. Mark and Laura exchanged a glance. It was past midnight and no one should have been there. Mark moved cautiously, peering through the peephole, but saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty. He opened the door slowly, feeling the cold air rush in. The silence outside was oppressive, pressing in on them like a living thing. Then they heard it, the soft, unmistakable whisper that had haunted them for weeks. Come back. Finish what was started. Laura staggered back, clutching her chest, her breath quickening. Mark slammed the door shut, locking it, but the whispering continued, filling the house, surrounding them. It was the doctor's voice, stronger and more malevolent than ever, its anger palpable. "It knows," Laura gasped. "It knows we tried to bind it." Mark grabbed her shoulders, looking into her eyes. "Then we have to end this, tonight." "But how?" Laura asked, her voice cracking. "We tried everything. It's too strong." Mark's jaw tightened. "We didn't destroy it. We only pushed it back. We have to go to the source. We have to burn that house to the ground." Laura felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "The house, it's part of it. It's where he died, where he did those things. You think burning it will stop him?" Mark nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "It's the only way. If we destroy the place that binds him, maybe we can finally break free." They prepared in silence, gathering what they needed: gasoline, matches, and the iron rod that had saved them once before. Mark called James, hoping he could join them, but there was no answer. They were on their own this time. The walk to the mansion felt like a march toward doom. The air was thick and cold, each breath crystallizing in the night. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the sky. Its windows were like eyes, watching them approach with silent malice. They reached the front door, finding it wide open, as if the house had been expecting them. Inside, the air was frigid. Their breath misted as they moved through the foyer, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. Mark led the way, gripping the can of gasoline, while Laura followed with the iron rod. They moved from room to room, splashing the gasoline against the walls, the furniture, the floors. The house seemed to groan with each step, the floorboards creaking and the walls whispering. They reached the basement last. Mark hesitated at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness below. He could feel it, the entity waiting, watching them from the shadows. Laura took his hand, squeezing it. "We do this together," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He nodded, and together they descended into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. They reached the bottom, standing before the operating table that had haunted their nightmares. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing as if alive. Mark poured the gasoline in a circle around the room, his movements swift and deliberate. Laura stood in the center, holding the iron rod, her eyes fixed on the symbols that seemed to watch her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the entity knew what they intended. "You cannot stop me," the voice hissed, filling the room with its venom. Mark struck a match, his hand trembling. He looked at Laura, their eyes locking in a moment of shared resolve. This was their last chance, their final stand. "Now," he whispered. He dropped the match onto the gasoline-soaked floor. Flames roared to life, rushing around the room in a blazing circle. The heat was immediate and intense, but the cold of the entity's presence fought against it, a battle of fire and ice. The entity screamed, a sound of rage and agony that shook the walls. Shadows erupted from the symbols, twisting and writhing, clawing at the flames. The house trembled, the walls cracking as the entity fought to maintain its hold. "Mark!" Laura cried as the shadows lunged toward her, their tendrils reaching for the iron rod in her hands. He grabbed her, pulling her back into the circle of fire. The flames roared higher, but the shadows kept coming, tearing through the air with a fury that defied the fire's heat. Laura raised the iron rod, thrusting it into the shadows. A blinding light exploded from the contact, and the entity screamed, a sound that reverberated through their bones. The basement walls began to collapse, the ceiling cracking as the fire consumed everything. The entity's form wavered, caught between the worlds. It let out one final anguished cry as the flames engulfed it, tearing it apart in a blaze of light and shadow. The house groaned, its foundation shaking. Mark grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her toward the stairs. They raced up as the mansion began to collapse around them, the fire raging, devouring every inch of the cursed structure. They burst through the front door and stumbled into the night, just as the mansion behind them imploded with a deafening roar, the flames shooting into the sky. They fell to the ground, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The mansion was a towering inferno, its darkness consumed by the fire that raged against the night. They watched in silence as it burned, the entity's final screams echoing in their minds. For a long time, they lay there, staring at the flames. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer creeping at the edge of their vision. The oppressive weight that had haunted them lifted, leaving behind a profound silence. The mansion was gone, reduced to smoldering ruins, its malevolence scattered into the night. Mark turned to Laura, his face smudged with ash, his eyes weary but hopeful. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Laura nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I think so. I feel free." They held each other, feeling the warmth of the fire on their faces, the cold of the entity's touch finally gone. For the first time in weeks, they felt peace. A fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. They had faced the darkness, confronted the terror that had sought to consume them, and they had survived. But as they walked away from the burning ruins hand in hand, a chill ran down Laura's spine. She glanced back at the smoldering heap where the mansion had stood. In the distance, she thought she saw a shadow move just for a moment before it disappeared into the smoke. She tightened her grip on Mark's hand and whispered, "Let's go home." They left the mansion behind, the fire blazing behind them like a beacon in the darkness. They didn't speak of the shadow, of the lingering fear that perhaps, somewhere in the ruins, a fragment of the entity remained. They would carry the scars of their ordeal forever, haunted by the knowledge that some evils are never truly vanquished. As they reached their house, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. They walked inside, closing the door behind them, and for the first time they felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way back to the light. But deep in the smoldering ashes of the mansion, beneath the charred remains, the air stirred, and in the quiet, a faint whisper carried on the wind, barely audible but filled with an ancient, undying malice. "It's not over."